Got kicked out at 18 for being too lazy. 10 years later, the same parents begged to move into the home I bought in cash. I was 18 when my dad put a trash bag on the porch and told me flatly, "You're lazy. Pack up and figure it out." It felt like someone had pulled all the air out of the room and left me standing on a cold tile floor with my whole life in one duffel bag. I remember the sound of the zipper closing, the way my hands trembled as I shoved the last of my socks inside, and I remember thinking, with an odd, fierce clarity, that whatever came next would not break me. I tell you that not because I want sympathy. I tell you that because the rest of this starts there. The night I left, the years I scraped together, the eventual payoff when I walked into a small 2-story colonial on a rainy Tuesday and signed the final papers in cash. 10 years later, my parents showed up on my porch asking to move in. They thought they were knocking on the door of their success. They were knocking on the door of mine. When they kicked me out, I flinched more from the look on my mother's face than from the words. It wasn't hate or anger. It was disappointed resignation, like she'd been waiting to say those words for a long time and finally did. My brother, who'd always been the favorite, watched like an indifferent spectator. He shrugged. "You always had it easy," he said, like that settled everything. I had a plan, a very small, stubborn plan. I would keep my head down, earn enough for a one-bedroom, and never ask them for help. But the plan didn't start with grand moves. It began with a job dishwashing at a diner that smelled of coffee and frying oil, and a bus pass I could barely afford. I slept on friends' couches when I could and in my car when I couldn't. I learned to love public libraries for the quiet and the free Wi-Fi. I learned to say no to people who wanted me to forget what had happened by smoothing over my life with empty words. There are a dozen versions of this story online, little triumph threads where someone who was pushed away becomes the person who can finally say no. I read them all, the ones about being quietly erased and then retaken seriously by the world, the ones about family members who only remember you when something useful, a house, a bank balance, a title, is suddenly within reach. I studied those arcs like a blueprint. Stories like the one about being kicked out at 17, and later buying a house in cash taught me how to map the long game and how to keep my dignity while I built. Those stories do more than entertain, they teach the mechanics of resolve. Work paid the bills and then it paid the down payment. I taught myself skills that had nothing to do with college lectures and everything to do with the immediate market. Excel formulas, basic web design, handling customers who screamed because their order was wrong, negotiating with vendors who thought they could undercut me. I learned to treat every small payment as a tool toward a larger goal. I learned to look at a Craigslist ad and see not a used couch, but the potential resale value that could be the difference between a month of food and a missed rent. A year in, I found a part-time gig doing social media for a local boutique. It paid poorly but gave me two things I needed: experience and a line on my resume that looked like a job rather than a stopgap. I taught myself WordPress on nights when I could hardly keep my eyes open. I read books on marketing in a laundromat with a battered paperback and a lint-coated coin. When the boutique owner hired me full-time to manage their online shop, my life tilted. The first thing I did with my paycheck was open a savings account. The second thing I did was set a ridiculous rule: I would never let my family know the number. When they'd show up years later and ask for a little help, I didn't want them to bargain with the figure in my account like a pawn on a chessboard. The next 5 years were a slow climb. I moved up in the boutique, then moved on to a small e-commerce company where I learned shipping logistics. I was terrible at first. I missed deadlines, miscounted inventory, and began most days with the cold sting of failure. I ingrained discipline by making lists I could finish. Every item checked off was a small, private victory, and an antidote to the old voice that called me lazy. I read the entrepreneurial anecdote about someone who had been dismissed by family and later amassed fortune. I didn't want the blinding money, I wanted the quiet proof that I could make things happen without their help. I wanted to be steady for myself. There were hard blindsides. My car broke down twice in one winter. A landlord increased rent 2 months before my contract bumped up. My brother had a child and suddenly was strapped for cash, and his tone on the phone suggested I should step in because I'd never needed anything. I didn't. I would call him once a week. That was it. I learned early that help handed back to people who hurt you rarely heals things, it just enables them. At 30, I moved to a mid-sized city, where a friend of a friend introduced me to a small startup in need of someone to run their online fulfillment. I took the job. The company was lean but hungry. We grew quickly. I learned negotiation with suppliers, discovered how a drop in refund rates could mean tens of thousands a year, and watched how small process improvements could create huge cash flow. More than the money, I loved the corrective power of practical skill. Solve an operational problem and watch the profit margin breathe easier. By 32, I'd saved aggressively. I lived roughly, no cable, a second-hand couch, home-cooked meals out of Tupperware on the living room floor. People outside my age bracket with my salary were buying Teslas and taking Mediterranean vacations. I bought solid shoes and fixed my credit. I invested in a small index fund and put money away each month like it was a mandatory tax. In my head, I developed a ridiculous ritual. Every time a direct deposit cleared, I'd set a portion of it into an account I labeled the house. It was a private altar built of spreadsheets, and I fed it with every extra dollar. This was not about spite. It was about creating a life the way I wanted it, instead of one I was handed. The housing market ricocheted through a couple of years of weirdness. Interest rates jumped, then dipped. Listings came and went. I learned to watch like a hawk. I learned neighborhoods that were undervalued but likely to appreciate because of new transit, new businesses, and influx of young professionals. I did this research like a hobby. I became fluent in property taxes and zoning. I learned to spot a house that the bank had over or underappraised, a property in the wrong hands that I could. One night at the end of a long day at the startup, my CEO sent me a link to a small, neglected colonial on a quiet street 2 neighborhoods over. Saw this and thought of you, he messaged, because he knew I liked fixer-uppers. The house was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with hardwood floors under years of carpet, a sagging front porch and ivy like a sad sweater. The listing price was low. The sellers were a family in probate, and the house had sat while paper shuffled. It was one of those deals people warn you about, probably hidden structural issues, possible mold, and old furnace. The numbers, however, whispered at me. If I could get a good contractor, if I could handle a bit of sweat equity, I could make it mine. The property tax was reasonable. The neighborhood had a coffee shop up the street and a new bike lane. The mortgage brokers had no idea this was, for me, more than an investment. It was a statement. They were willing to finance, but I'd been saving for something else. A few months earlier, I had been offered a bonus for work well done at the startup, and I tucked most of it into my house account. That night, after much internal wrestling, I did something that has stayed with me. I cashed out 3 small, low-yield investments and marched into the bank with a check. I bought the house in cash. For people who have never held a real estate closing document in their hands, it is hard to explain the feeling. It's both mundane and holy. A pile of legal forms, signatures, and an older man with a pen who tells you, "Congratulations." The closing agent told me the transfer would clear the next day. I remember walking out into a mild rain with the key in my pocket and feeling an enormous, quiet glee. Not bragging. Not vindictive. Quiet. This house was mine, built on years of scrimping and real work and quiet afternoons spending hours on spreadsheets. I moved in slowly. I painted rooms in the small hours. I tore out carpeting and refinished floors until my hands had tiny splinters like battle scars I'd earned. I learned to patch drywall. I learned to read a permit. I learned which contractors were honest and which would pad estimates. I made the house my own, not out of fury toward the people who'd kicked me out, but because I wanted to build a home that was stable, practical, and kind. A place where a friend could come and sit on the porch if the weather was bad, where food could be cooked in the kitchen without dread. 3 years passed. The house appreciated modestly, not a miracle, just steady upward movement. Financially, I was comfortable but not ostentatious. I bought the kind of things that didn't advertise wealth. A reliable car, a good mattress, a small emergency fund that made my stomach stop nodding. I started to travel occasionally to places I'd seen in travel essays and thought I would one day visit. It felt surreal to stand in a coastal town and think, finally, I can afford to sit here and do nothing for a while without panicking about rent. My family didn't know how to meet this new reality. They called sporadically for a while after I bought the house. Holiday texts that read like negotiated pleasantries, but something changed after their first few attempts to re-enter my life. It felt like they smelled cash and came sniffing. That's the cruel truth about some family dynamics. The love arrives late and is usually conditional on your having something to offer. I had decided I would not be lured back into being anyone's ATM. Then came the summer before my 38th birthday when my father called. His voice was clipped. My mother was on speaker and there was an undercurrent of panic I'd never heard before. "We're between places," my mother said. "Nathan lost his job, there were some complications. We were wondering could we come stay for a bit." She couched it with every euphemism and old tactic she could think of. "It's temporary, we'll pay rent, we'll do yard work." Listen, I thought I did as a child. I lived through guilting and obfuscation. I did not say no immediately, I was not cruel. I simply asked a question I'd learned to protect myself with: what changed? They told me a story about a job, a medical bill, a failed business. The longer the story, the more it felt like an outline for a hymn written to persuade. "We need a month or two," my father said. "We have nowhere else to go." My mother added, "Please think of family." At that moment, a dozen smaller memories flooded back. The trash bag on the porch, the years of silence, the way my mother had smiled when I failed. I leaned back in my chair and counted slowly. 10 years, 3 moves, countless nights of soup and library Wi-Fi. My breath was steady. I could feel the old smallness rise in my chest, the voice that called me lazy, but it no longer had authority. I told them the truth. "You kicked me out when I was 18, I said. "I slept in my car and ate ramen. I fixed every plumbing leak and learned to change a tire because I had to. I invested every extra dollar to buy this house and I didn't tell you for a reason. You showed up asking for help when I had nothing and left when I had everything. I can't make those years vanish." Silence on the other end. Then an old tactic: manufacture shame. "You're being selfish," my mother said. "Family helps family." I had empathy for my mother. I really did. But empathy is not the same as surrender. "Family helps family," I replied. "But family also hurts family. I'm not available to be an on-call safety net for choices you made. If you want to rebuild a relationship, fine. But I can't let the past be erased by a few days of charm." I heard my father flinch when I said it. They said they would pay rent, they said they would get jobs. They said they were sorry. They volunteered to do the yard work and to chip in. They begged. The asking was clumsy, designed to make me feel like the one being mean if I said no. I made a counteroffer. Not vindictive, practical. I would help them find a place, but it would not be my house. I would help with a deposit up to a point. I would not let them live there. I offered to find resources, housing lists, employment leads, a limited short-term loan to bridge an emergency if they agreed to documented conditions, repayment plans, attendance at meetings to address whatever issues had put them in this position, and a full accounting of finances. The conditions were not punishment, they were boundaries. For 10 years I'd learned that family is often used to erase accountability. I wanted a relationship that did not depend on enabling harm. They reacted as I half expected, anger then tears. "After all I did for you," my father sputtered, trying to manufacture the old hierarchy. "You're turning your back." I said calmly, "I'm not turning my back. I'm drawing a line and offering help on one side of it." My sister, who had once laughed when I left with a trash bag, called and shouted, accusing me of being selfish and cruel. Friends messaged me privately to ask if we'd finally made up. Social media lit up with relatives asking for updates. It was the exact reaction the files I'd read had warned me about. Sudden interest, selective recollection, and a moral performance expecting me to hand out absolution as if it were candy. I thought of a post I'd read, someone's Christmas humiliation story, where the family planned an intervention in front of guests. Those stories taught me the difference between public performance and sincere change. I stayed firm. I helped them where I could without letting the old pattern resume. I found a small rental a few towns over that would accept a deposit equal to what they'd initially asked for in rent, and I agreed to cover half the deposit on the condition they sign a lease in their name and provide proof of job applications. I spent 3 days sitting with city housing counselors and a nonprofit that assists people transitioning from unstable housing. I drafted an agreement, simple, professional, and asked them to sign it. My mother signed it with one finger trembling. My father hesitated but then did. They moved into the small rental. My mother cried in my kitchen the morning they left. It was not apologetic, it was exhausted relief. I handed her a box of my grandmother's old plates, small, cheap things, and said simply, "Take care of yourself." She hugged me then like it was news to both of us. It was not the grand reunion I'd imagined in the years I'd waited for them to call. It was quieter. It was practical. For me, that mattered more. What people miss in these stories is that triumph isn't always a triumphant gloat. It's frequently a small, quiet assertion of agency. It's refusing to let old wounds repeat because someone now looks hungry. It's setting conditions so a relationship can have a chance to be something different. My house, the one I bought in cash, the one I'd finished painting late at night, wasn't just a trophy. It was a tool and a symbol, a place from which I could offer help without being complicit in the patterns that had hurt me. Of course, the story didn't end neatly. There were awkward dinners, attempts at reconciliation that felt like the actors learning lines, and one or two backsliding moments where they asked me to cover an unexpected expense, and then acted like it was my duty. Each time I said no, and each time it stung in ways it hadn't before. Their disappointment hardened into an odd, distant respect. Not gratitude, that would have been too much, but a kind of recognition that I'd become something they couldn't easily swallow into their old scripts. I didn't cut them off entirely. I saw them at family gatherings, now more genuine and less performative because the dynamic had changed. We talked about the small things, my favorite bakery around the corner, a new neighbor with a terrible leaf blower. We didn't talk about the worst years unless they asked, and then asked clearly. When my father called one winter to tell me he'd had a minor heart scare, I went. He'd finally gotten himself a physician and was taking his meds. He didn't deserve the gift of the visit because he'd been a saint. He deserved it because despite everything I wanted him alive and better than before. That was not weakness. It was a choice informed by clarity and not by the old currency of guilt. 10 years after the trash bag, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched a neighbor's kid ride a bike. The house felt lived in. There were pictures on the wall that weren't staged for social media. They were real. A friend's kid who'd spent a weekend, a potluck night where people laughed until it hurt. My mother called sometimes to ask about the soup recipe that had become our comfort dish. She still had a way of slipping into old roles, but that too changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But I had built a life that allowed me to say no without burning bridges and to open doors without being trampled. The payoff wasn't the house itself. The real triumph was the quiet that follows mastery. It's the absence of the old frantic scramble, the muscle memory to know when to hold steady, the ability to help on one's own terms. When parents come asking, the easy epic response is either to slam the door in their face or to hand the keys over and restore the old pattern. I did neither. I negotiated outcomes that preserved my well-being and allowed them to step up, or step out, on their own. If you ask me now whether I regret the cold nights, the bus rides, or the 30-year-old me who slept on whatever couch would have me, the answer is no. I would not recommend all of it as a learning path that everyone should endure. Some of it was bone-deep, unnecessary cruelty. But if you're asking whether those years were wasted, or whether they were part of the curriculum that taught me how to be careful, how to save, how to build, and how to set borders, then no. They taught me how to demand a life that matched the work I put in. They taught me how to insist that love be real, not a transaction. I used to imagine standing at my parents' door with the exact amounts I'd paid them back written on a ledger. I fantasized about dramatic reveals, mocking speeches, revenge. That's the fun fantasy. The reality is quieter and for me truer. I bought a house, I made a life, and when my parents needed help, I offered it on terms that sustained me. That's a kind of victory too. Not the one you brag about on a podium. The one you tell your future self at night when the house is silent, and you can finally hear the sound of your own breath. That's worth more than any applause. If you're reading this because you were pushed away and you wonder whether the hustle matters, I'll tell you plainly, it does. Work the long plan. Save the stupid funds. Learn practical skills. Let the quiet small wins accumulate until they form a foothold you can stand on. And when people who hurt you come back, remember, compassion is an option but surrender is not. Help can come with dignity. That's how you win, not by erasing the past, but by building a present that does not repeat it.